With all of the preparations completed, it was finally time to take the engine out of my garage and put it into my car. Putting the engine into the car is as simple as picking it up with an engine hoist and dropping it into the engine bay, or is it? Having performed this process quite a few times over the years, I can tell you that it's not that simple. There's quite a few adjustments needed.
From a red top to a gray top.
Yeah.
That's a few that means no significance at all. What's this?
What?
That.
Alternator bracket?
No. Rusty.
Oh hell.
Too late now.
Yeah. I can always change that.
Much easier now.
Alright. Let me get this out of the way. Alright. Start turning that.
Turning.
Yeah, turn the engine side as much as you can. Now start lowering a little bit.
How do I lower again?
Okay, hold up. Come here. Just hold the transmission like this. And as I lower it, you're going to slowly but surely just guide it towards where it needs to go, okay?
Which is right under the car.
Yeah.
Alright, push forward. Alright, drop.
Here's the point where our program went bilingual, kind of like an automotive Dora the Explorer. Okay, ahora no, levántalo un poco, tráncalo y levántalo un poco. Levanta, sí, con ese palo. Ok, empuja la vaina más para adelante. El engine stand.
Más para allá.
Más para adelante. Sí,
Levántalo un poco.
Levanta el motor. I'm going to come from the other side. Getting an engine into a car is a process that requires many adjustments, and I've actually cut those adjustments down in half by the fact that I have the transmission attached to the motor. If you have to drop a motor into an engine bay and align it to a transmission, it's a bit of a nightmare. It's much easier, in my opinion, to just drop the motor in with the transmission and put forth the extra effort to guide that transmission in and align it properly and whatnot. At the end of the day, it makes it simpler, and you get a much better clutch job, and you don't run the risk of the transmission shaft smashing the clutch. Here my dad's making a point on safety. Never stand underneath an engine hoist. And here's where worker number 4 showed up. While you really could do this between 2 people, or even 1 if you had the right equipment, the more people you have around helping to adjust things and position things properly, the better it is. We ended up making many adjustments in order to get the engine to sit down right and get the motor mounts to line up. One thing that helped a lot was actually to put a jack underneath the transmission such that we could get the angle of the transmission perfect. At that point, the motor mounts were a lot easier to line up. Another thing to keep in mind is that there are these metal plates that go over the motor mounts in the Miata, and these will tend to fall off as you're trying to put the engine in. So we put tape around these in order to hold them in and keep them from being an annoyance. With the engine installed in the car, we moved on to a series of other tasks necessary to get it running. I changed this old fuel filter. This part I don't like. There's always a little bit of a mess. At this point, getting the car back on the road just involved a bunch of small steps like putting the drive shaft back in, changing out the fuel filter because I had an old crummy one, and adding the radiator and fans back in, wiring that up, and adding all the different fluids and connecting all the electronics back up to the car. None of those steps are particularly difficult, but they are time consuming and you have to make sure to do it right, or else the first time you turn your car back on, it might be a bit of a catastrophe.
Alright, so the only thing that I have left over in order to get my new engine install done is to put the drive shaft back in. Now, in order to do this, because I didn't put the drive shaft into the transmission as I was dropping it in, which would have been ideal, I've got to undo it at the drive shaft. Now, in order to do that, I need to take some safety precautions. I've got the car pretty high up so that I have room to work. And you'll notice that I have 4 jack stands. I have a jack stand here on the jacking position. Have a jack stand there on my reinforced frame rail on both sides. And on the opposite end on the other jacking point. Got a stack of wooden blocks here, so if the car were to fall on this side, I've got some clearance there. Coming around, another jack stand here. My jack is there. And I've got the jack stand I mentioned earlier. We've got some long wooden boards, and they're just keeping the car from rolling forward off of the ramps. Now, I also pushed in the brakes, so they're locked right now. Car's really not likely to roll, but it's good to take precautions. So in order to get these drive shaft bolts off, they're actually under pretty strong. They're pretty hard to get out. What I'm doing is I'm heating them up with a micro torch, and that seems to be working really well. I've already gotten 2 of them loose, so I'll just get you guys a view of that. Got a pickle fork stuck into the U-joint in order to keep the drive shaft from spinning as I'm undoing the bolts. That pickle fork had to be good for something, because it's not good for undoing ball joints, I'll tell you that much. Drive shaft bolts are size 14. So we've got a ratchet, an extension here, size 14 bolts. I suspect that these bolts might have some kind of Loctite on them, so that's why I'm using the micro torch. Either way, if there's any corrosion, which is what was making it impossible to undo them, the micro torch will help with that. So next bolt right here. We'll heat that nut. You don't need to put a wrench on the opposite end, because the drive shaft actually has some little blocks that stick out and keep the bolt from spinning on this side. It's pretty trick.
I followed those steps over and over again until I had all the bolts out of the drive shaft. From there I stuck the other end of the drive shaft into the transmission's tail shaft and then moved this end of the drive shaft back on and bolted it back together.
Alright, now we're going to torque the bolts to spec, and we're ready to go on this drive shaft.
So I torqued down all of the drive shaft bolts to spec, and then I went around and did all of the ones for the power plant frame.
That's that. That's why you gotta have as many jack stands as you can possibly put under the car.
After that I added transmission fluid, tested my electrical fans, and finally it was time to turn the engine on. I was starting to feel a little impatient at this point, so I got out of the car and went and checked that nothing was unplugged.
Pero él trató de encender.
Parece todavía tampoco le llega bien combustible.
Puede ser.
Having noticed that everything was connected properly, I got back in the car and I gave it another go. So you can likely imagine, this time around, it was a success. Thank you for following this engine series with me, and stay tuned for more updates on this car on Proper Style.